All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SCE Group and PKWARE webinar, Overcoming the Complexities of Data Protection. I'm Bridget Kaplan, the Marketing Manager for the SCE Group. Our call today will be hosted by John Police, who is the Vice President of North America Sales for the SCE Group, and Blair Semple, Senior Director of Business Development for PKWARE. Before beginning, I want to point out the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please submit any questions you have and we will answer them after the presentation. Now I'd like to hand it off to John.
Thank you, Bridget. And thanks everybody for joining us today for Data Protection Managed Services and to discuss the complexities of data protection as a whole. Want to just go into a little bit of just data protection and the information age and where we are today as we see things in the landscape. So if we look back before the last 10 years, data protection was done in a different manner. A lot of organizations, large and small, really had a perimeter-based model where everything was available and accessible just via a hub and spoke model where all the data stayed within the confines of an organization. So data protection took on a different method at that time. It was all centrally located, it was easy to manage and effectively secure it. Today, we look at the world as it is now with the internet, and it has brought on a lot more in an agility and a flexibility on how data is transferred and communicated throughout organizations today, and how operations are managed through companies and how businesses are built. And we look at how businesses run today. They're not running just with their own organizations, but there's a lot of alliances and a lot of partnerships and a lot of contractors as well. Now, when you look at that landscape, there's data that needs to be communicated and passed and transferred through a lot of different groups. In that regard, you have consultants, you have third-party alliances and partnerships that are helping organizations to transact business and operate much more efficiently and almost at the speed of light. And it's really just taking that competitive edge and gaining, in their industry so they can stay ahead and be on top. It's very fast-paced. But that brings on a lot of challenges as well and complexities around securing data, because at the end of the day, there's sensitive information that needs to be transferred between all of these organizations back and forth. And I haven't even mentioned cloud. And you look at the adoption of cloud and data migration that's taken on this year and the end of last year has just grown tremendously. So again, there's more distribution of data in even more ways than we even envisioned even 2 or 3 years ago. So organizations now, not just at the large side of the global organizations that have to deal with the complexities of data transfer, but it also comes down to the small, the SMBs and the small enterprise as well. They have to deal with the same type of complexities that only large organizations had to deal with years ago. And how can that be done, right? When you look at the resources that we have available, that organizations have available to them today from an IT perspective, and even a data security perspective. We see the shortage of full-time employment and subject matter expert resources in the marketplace that make it very demanding and challenging to be able to even bring these people on and be able to support security and data protection, internally. So with that in mind, we decided to work with PKWARE and partner with them with their best-of-breed technologies and our process and our people to put together a managed service that could be delivered not only to a large organization but to any company out there, large or small, that has to deal with the challenge of protecting data today. And that's what we're here to talk about with everyone. Get the slide to move here for a moment. There we go. Sorry about that. So if we look at the basic fundamentals of security, if there's anything we've all been taught is no matter how much security we have in an organization, no matter how mature, they're only as safe as the weakest link in that organization from that perspective. And that's something that we've known for a long, long time. And this is what organizations are challenged with tackling day in and day out to stay ahead of. But you also have to quantify risk and quantify security as well. in the event of a breach or a risk or something like that, what type of dollar value is there on that's associated with that? We've seen this in the newspapers years and years now. The amounts of money, millions and sometimes can be close to billions of dollars of money that has been due to the risk of breach and malware and the attacks that have happened. And I just break down into these tiles just a couple samples of some of the most common industries, if you will, dealing with the cost of a data breach. And I bring in healthcare and also the financial services markets as samples. So the first tile shows $408 is the cost of a breach per record in the healthcare industry today. Electronic medical records have taken on a huge risk by taking things from paper files and putting them electronically and then sharing them over the internet has created a great deal of risk and a lot of value to those records on the dark web when they get into the wrong hands. We've seen the same thing for many years now from the global financials as well. And there's a per capita cost of a data breach of about $206 in that industry. So definitely there's a level of money involved here to justify the reasons behind the security and the protection that's needed for data today. But just take away from just the cost value of it, we can quantify those as we did based on the records. But when you look at the last tile, this is more about reputation and confidence. And that's very difficult to put a price tag on. And we look at this, the percentage of consumers that say most companies actually handle the personal data very responsibly is 1 in 4. So 25% of the general public can absolutely say publicly that organizations are taking care of their personal data at a level of expectation. And that's a very massive statement right there. Over the years also, this reason of having to secure this data and these breaches that we've seen in the paper year over year, and now it's daily. I mean, you could have a stock market ticker practically on the bottom of your screen if you wanted to just see the breaches that are happening in real time. It's just incredible to see what's happening, day in and day out today. And this has brought on the regulators to get involved because they need to govern and protect us and the general public as best as they possibly can and make sure that the organizations out there that have our personal property, if you will, that they're doing what needs to be done to protect it at a means that's acceptable not only to us, but to the governments as well and around the world. So you look at the financial industry, you have Fed, you have HIPAA with the healthcare industry, PCI regulating from a retail perspective around our credit cards. These have been around for quite a while, and some of them have actually, have a lot of teeth right now, where you're seeing a lot of massive fines being imposed on some of these regulatory bodies today. But the most recent one that's hit everybody, and I say everybody as a whole because it actually has, is the General Data Protection Regulation in the middle of the screen. You look at the financial and the healthcare and the retail, and you can say, you know what, that's great for those organizations, but my business isn't in that industry, so I don't have to worry. They're really siloed to those industries. GDPR, on the other hand, really changes the game because it says from the EU saying, if you have our personal data, you have to protect it at a certain level, no matter what your business is. If my personal data is within your property and you're managing that, that's sensitive data, and that has to be held in a high regard, and it needs to be secured and due diligence proven on that security as a whole. And it goes across every industry at that point. So look at your small organizations and startups today. You go out, you decide on a plan, a business plan, you build a business, and the first thing you do is you put up a website and you start your business like everybody does in this new time today. The minute your website becomes available to the internet publicly, you've become a global organization overnight. And with that, you're tied to general data protection regulations. Think about that. So now you have the complexities And you have the responsibility with those two complexities of securing sensitive data and making sure what's sensitive and taking care of it and proving that due diligence, or there's going to be fines imposed. So if you look at this slide and the one before, one comes at it at a security perspective, and this comes at it from a regulatory perspective. And the reason I show these two is because when you talk about us and you that are on this call, on this webinar, you're dealing with the challenges from an operational perspective in your jobs. From a security perspective, you need to justify to your organization, to the leadership, why you need funding to support the protection of data, to better secure data for the organization. And you need to quantify that risk, which is what we did in the last slide. You need to show a good, hard, fast dollar amount to the leadership and the board so that that justifies the means for them to provide funding and approve funding to enable you to better protect that company and their data. So that's an upstream conversation. When you look at it from a regulatory perspective on this slide, that conversation is inverted. It's completely changed now. Now it's the board coming down to the operations people, to us, and saying, you know what, we have these regulations that we need to adhere to, and I, as a board of director or a leadership on council, need to sign the dotted line saying that we're doing everything possible to meet this regulatory requirement from a due diligence perspective to secure that data. And if that's not the case when I'm audited, I'm personally liable as well as the company is liable, and fines can be imposed. So that changes the game from a funding perspective especially. This is now the board coming down to us and saying, what are we doing about this? Because I have to answer for it. And they're looking for answers and results right away. So funding becomes available, but we need to do something now, which puts a lot of stress and pressures on us. It's kind of a double-edged sword. So let's go through the complexities of building a data protection program. So we start out by looking at the first thing that needs to be done. Before you can invoke any type of program for a data protection or data security, you first have to discover where your sensitive data is. Now, that data is going to be, like I said, distributed in nature. It's going to be, maybe you're leveraging a colo in your organization. There's a third party that has your unstructured or structured data in their colo location. Maybe there's other alliances and partnerships you have with third parties to provide a service to you, need access to sensitive data, so it could be distributed there. There's also the mobile workforce, which, by the way, when you think mobile workforce, you think sales, but that's no longer the case today. Many organizations outside of just the sales team have part-time work from home hours. So this means they're taking their laptops, but even more concerning, they may be having some of that data on their personal desktops in their homes that not just they're using, but other people in the family have access to. So you need to understand where the data is first. Once we've understood where the data is, it's distributed and how it's distributed and transferred, the next thing we need to do is when we look at that sensitive data, we need to understand what types of sensitive data are we dealing with in our company. There's many different variations of that. There's merger and acquisition data. There's intellectual property. There's also PCI regulated data when it comes down to credit cards or personal identifiable information, which could be driver's license, social security numbers, things of that nature. And then there's electronic medical records. There's healthcare information in the history from an electronic medical record. Each different type of sensitive information that I've just brought to an example carries with it a different set of policies or a policy in order to classify, in order to invoke a protection or security around that data. So we have to classify and categorize the data once we've found it. The next thing we need to do, once we've classified that data and we've built policy around those classifications, we now have to understand how are we going to control the access to that data. But more importantly, let's break down that access from an internal perspective and also an external perspective. We have to, how are we going to handle that? as we classify that data, who has access to it, read access, modify access. And is that access, was the change, is the policy different to access that data externally as opposed to internally in my organization? Once we understand that and we build policy around access as well, now we have to govern and monitor that data to govern that it's actually being followed, that the access is working, the classifications and policies that we've invoked are actually in place and working. So we have to monitor that sensitive data to ensure that the plans and programs we put in place are actually protecting that data and it's following policy and process. Now, we just covered a great deal of things. You can see it's a very complex process to protect data for an organization today. But at the end of it all, we have to prove this to the regulatory bodies as well and to our leadership and show them that this is what we're doing to protect that data. It's one thing to protect it, but it's another to be able to prove that you're protecting it to those people, to the powers that be. And lastly, there's always been that challenge of balance between security and business enablement that everybody on this call, I'm sure, has experienced in tackling those challenges day in and day out. So how do you go about making sure that data is protected according to all of these bullets that we've just discussed, but also making sure that that is as seamless as possible so that it does not negatively impact the organization or the operation from a performance perspective? Business needs to be transacted and run as usual. And security just has to be. And that's what we need to figure out. So at this time, I want to hand it over to Blair so that he can go through some of the industry regulations and see how, and we can talk about how they overlap from a data protection perspective.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that a lot. And I think you've done a really good job so far of laying down the foundation of what some of these challenges are, the challenges as they apply to data and what data does and where it goes and who needs to see it, and some of the groups that are mandating, excuse me, how data should be processed, and then the steps that we'd have to go through to properly employ a data protection strategy. We didn't intend in this webinar to give you an education on these various compliance regulations, but I wanted to highlight a couple things from 3 of them that really reflect, I think, the nature of what regulatory compliance means to you and to your data. The first example is PCI, the payment card industry. So this is for anybody who processes or holds credit card information. I think if you look at the fundamental requirements, you'll see that they're around, first of all, protecting cardholder data and preventing account numbers from exposure. Makes perfect sense. We've all seen all the headlines and lots of examples of how data's been compromised. But it's also interesting that it goes into a couple other aspects. One is safely transmit cardholder data when it's sent across the network. And John talked about the internet and how the internet enables so much connectivity and capability, but it also certainly creates risk. And specifically also calls out ensuring cardholder data is never sent in unencrypted emails. I think part of what is interesting to me when I look at those requirements is, while there are things that apply to a piece of data, it also does have some impact on the way that we protect that data. So if, as an example, we use encryption, which is obvious as one of the solutions to some of these PCI requirements, if I encrypt a drive and I store the data on the drive, that probably helps me to a certain extent with 1 and 2, but it's not going to help me if I transmit that cardholder data over a network or if I send it via email, because it's the drive that's encrypting the data. So it really indicates an awareness of the requirement for things like data-aware protection, where I'm actually protecting the data and that protection moves with the data wherever the data goes, versus simply protecting the place where the data lives at any moment in time. If we look at the next example, again, this is focused more on HIPAA and therefore the healthcare industry, but you can again look at the big blocks of what you're required to do. Ensure that private healthcare information always remains protected, okay? Securely exchange with authorized parties. In the healthcare industry, it's very important that we have the ability for one organization to share patient data with another organization, but to do so securely and make sure that it's only shared with authorized individuals. Prevent fraud, hacking, and other threats to PHI. So a big part of that involves both release of sensitive data, but also managing the integrity of the data, making sure someone can't tamper with it, go in and change a test result, etc. And prevent intentional or accidental violations by insiders. I personally have been involved in information security for longer than I want to admit out loud. I think 22 years now. When I first started talking to people, breaches were almost all, like 80, the original stats when we had them were 80% of breaches were caused by insiders. Didn't necessarily mean malicious insiders. Could just be somebody who clicked the wrong button at the wrong time. I think we've seen that landscape change now. There certainly is a lot more adversarial attacks from the outside, but making sure that protection applies to data in such a way that users can't intentionally or accidentally do things to release data is something that's still a fundamental information security requirement. And you can see that's called out here for HIPAA. And if we go to the last one, GDPR. So John talked a little bit about GDPR. I think GDPR is interesting because a lot of people would perceive GDPR today as a European regulation. John gave an example of why that's not entirely true, because it applies to citizens of the EU, and anyone who does business and holds data on a citizen of the EU is subject to GDPR. You can see what some of the requirements are. Encrypt personally identifiable information, make sure that account numbers are protected when they're stored. Enable the right to be forgotten is something new. That basically says if I have a relationship with an organization, they're holding my personal information. When I sever that relationship, I have the right for them to forget me. And what that really means is have them get rid of my data so that it's not hanging around anymore. And the last thing is the concept of implementing data protection by design. Having the switch turned on at the beginning so that data is always protected, not having it be a switch that has to get turned on to protect the data. Those are some of the specific GDPR requirements that exist from the EU today. I think one of the things that's really interesting, though, is we're starting to see these GDPR-like requirements flow throughout the world. Here in the US, several states are looking at their own versions of GDPR. There's a little bit of talk of a federal regulation around it. We're seeing other non-European countries and groups of countries look at deploying and enforcing these kinds of regulations. The other thing that John didn't really touch on, which I think is really interesting about the EU implementation of GDPR, is traditionally we've seen things like rigid fines. You know, this happens, you get fined X amount of dollars. GDPR in the EU regulations is also very interesting that it's tied to the revenue of your company. So the bigger you are as a company, the bigger your fines can be. And that just, again, reinforces how important it is for everyone to look at these characteristics of data protection and ensuring that they deploy it to sensitive data. Now, what I'd like to do is just take a couple minutes and give you a few examples of some use cases that things like the Data Protection Managed Service can deploy. If you go to the next slide for me, John, and you can go ahead and start doing the build out. Basically, I'm going to give you some examples. Without actually doing a demo, we're going to give you some PowerPoint demos. But I wanted just to make sure that we're all on the same page. You'll see that I'll be using some kind of standard Microsoft Office file. So it's a Word file. You all recognize that icon there. But there's a couple new things you might not have seen before. The next one is classified files. So John talked about the need to classify data. When we talk about classification for unstructured data files, we're really talking about something similar to if you're like me and you watch a lot of old black and white movies, you've probably seen where someone had a government document that had a big stamp on the top. Secret or top secret or ultra secret or all these made up designations in many cases in the movies. Classification is basically the same thing applying to an electronic data file. The ability to put a stamp on it that indicates the nature and the sensitivity of the data that's inside that file and ensure that I process and handle it properly. So in this case, we have examples of a red classification file and a yellow. That could be company confidential, it could be personal private, it could be PCI, it could be company secret. The concept, though, is simply that you can define for yourself the classifications that are required for you and your data. And when a file has been classified, the user sees a visual indication, just like that rubber stamp, to indicate what's in that file. The next one that you might not have seen is an encrypted file. So in this case, this is a Microsoft Word file, but because of that addition to the icon, the SmartCrypt Shield, that tells me that the file has been encrypted. So now I know visually by looking at it that that file has been encrypted and is safe. And in the last example, we just combine those. So here we have an example of an encrypted file with the red classification tier on it. And you're going to see these files as I walk through the use cases, but I just wanted to be sure that you understood it. One thing though that this, if you just hold on 1 second on that slide, John, for me, if you don't mind. The one thing that this really does make clear is one of the points that I made earlier. When I apply a classification tag to a file, that's going to move around with the file. If I copy it to a USB stick, or if I upload it to the cloud, or if I email it, that classification marking goes with the file. Equally, if I encrypt a file, well, it's the file that's encrypted. So if I copy that file to a USB stick, or I email it, send it to the cloud, copy it to my home computer, some of the challenges John described earlier, the encryption is going to move with the file. And I think that's a really fundamental part of what we're going to talk about with the Data Protection Managed Service, that we're securing the data much more than we're securing the thing the data lives on or the wire the data moves across. And it enables a much greater set of capabilities to protect that sensitive data when we protect the data itself. So now we can go ahead and look at a couple examples. And again, these are fairly simple examples, but I just wanted to give you a couple examples of things you might be able to do with the Data Protection Managed Service. In the first case, if you have a data classification policy, wouldn't it be really interesting if you could generate a report that says what users have certain classified data on their laptops or on their workstations or on their home computers? So in this case, you'll see we have a Microsoft Word file. We've designated it personal private. We could set up a policy that says, go check every user and report every instance of a personal private classified file on those users' machines. If you build this out, John, we'll actually see the report's going to say, in this case, there's a user named Blair Semple. We found a file with that classification tag on his device, and we'll report on it. And we can therefore take action. The action might simply be to say, okay, we understand and this is acceptable, or it might be to say, we need to do something about this, and I'll give you some examples as we proceed of other policies where we could actually take action on this. In the second use case, really simple case again, wouldn't it be great if we were in an organization that processed credit card data, if every time a user stored a piece of credit card information on their workstation, on their desktop, on their laptop, that file was automatically classified so it could be managed properly and encrypted to ensure that it was secured. So in this case, we'll see we have a Word file. Inside that Word file is just some text. There's no credit card information in there at all. If the user for some reason was to type in a credit card number, you guys can capture this if you want. It's not a real credit card number, but it looks like one. And save that file, then that file will automatically be saved, then be encrypted, then be classified. It takes place without the user doing any extra steps. The user didn't save the file and then say, oh my goodness, I should prepare this file properly. The user saved the file, and the system said, we have a policy that says if this user stores a credit card info in a file, we should encrypt and classify it. And that took place automatically. My next example, again, is credit card related, but remember this could be any type of data. Wouldn't it be great if any time that we had sensitive data on a user's workstation, we quarantined the original file and then we redacted out the sensitive information? Now my example here is a credit card again, to give you the flow for what happens, but I've got a file, it's got credit card numbers in it, the user saves it. Well, that original file is copied into a quarantine location where it's locked up. The original file is opened up. The credit card numbers are redacted, or at least the middle 6 in this particular case are redacted. And the file name is changed to have the same name but got redacted on top of it. This is a really popular use case we're seeing more and more, where you can actually run through every user's device, and if you find sensitive information that should not be on the device, you can quarantine it off the device and then redact out the sensitive information. And if the user was to type in another credit card number and save it, that would automatically be detected again. The file would be quarantined, the new file would be quarantined, the new file would be opened up, the credit card redacted, and the file would be saved again. Again, in all these cases, I really want you to understand that the user isn't doing anything extra. The user is simply doing their job, saving a file, and the system, based on policy, is making decisions about how to handle that file. The last example is, again, another simple one, but let's say we had an old project. We didn't want users carrying around data relating to that old project. Wouldn't it be great if we could just get rid of it? Well, in this particular example, we have an old project called Hydrogen Tiger. We could define a policy that says anytime you see data about Hydrogen Tiger, you should just delete it. And I'll be honest with you guys, the first time I saw this use case, I was a little skeptical. I found it hard to believe that organizations would just go around deleting data off of users' computers. While the system is certainly capable of doing it, the example that I was given the first time, which actually did make a lot of sense to me, was the enterprise ran the discovery search, found and reported on all the users that had data relating to the old project, sent them an email and said, you have data relating to this old project. If it's still there in a week, we're going to delete it. So it gave them the ability to report on what the users had, ask the users to take care of that data using proper data security techniques. But if they didn't, they still had that final sledgehammer of just getting the data off of the users' devices. So John, that's the compliance and use case content I had to go through. Love to turn it back over to you now.
Great, thanks, Blair. So let's go into a couple of options that organizations like yourselves have available to you when it comes to building out a data protection managed service, or a data protection program, I'm sorry. So if we look at the first example, it's something that every one of us is very familiar with, is doing it ourselves. So if you look at building out your own data protection or data security program, there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. There's a lot of moving parts as well. First off, you have to build your own program. And we went through the complexities, if you will, in the earlier slides of the different levels that are a part of that and associated with it in order to build a comprehensive program. There's also content involved and staff that needs to be hired as well and trained. So in the end of the day, when your leadership or board is asking you to quantify what you need for a budget perspective to build this program, it's very difficult to really come up with an accurate number right offhand. And in addition to that, when you look at how long what's the answer to meet this and get it in production, when they ask you that, to build it yourself can take quite a long time. In some cases, could take up to 2 years. So there's also the other example as an option as well. And there's plenty of tools out there, one-offs, if you will, over the years that we see for data loss prevention or data encryption or whole disk encryption. There's a lot of different variations of ways to secure data today by buying a tool. But at the end of the day, as we know with any application or any tool we buy, it's not going to build the program for us. It's only going to complement the program that's already in place. So you're still going to need the program. You're also going to need resources as well to support, administer, and maintain this application or this tool. There's also different deployment scenarios for everybody's environment. Everyone's architecture, network, and asset architecture is completely different. And deployments of using open APIs to integrate data into other platforms, whether it be GRC or other big data platforms for analytics, have to be taken into account as well. Not to mention, you still need to train that staff on this new platform tool also. So just the cost of a tool, the licensing, is only scratching the surface of what something like this is really going to cost end to end. And getting it in production and being able to leverage it to protect your data can take a significant amount of time as well, a year to a year and a half. There's also the option, we're talking about a managed service here, but when I talk about this outsource, it's not exactly a managed service more than it's just leveraging a general consulting skill pool or like an Accenture, if you will. So a lot of organizations, some of you that are on this call may already have this, have a general consulting contract with a company like an Accenture who can provide you exactly that. General consultants, bodies, if you will, that can perform specific duties or tasks that you assign to them. But when you look at them, they are exactly what I said. They're generalists. And I kind of compare them to the drone bee when you look at a bee's nest, right? They are given a task and they do that task better than anyone from beginning to the end of the day, and that's it. And that's exactly what a general consultant's going to be in this example. So you're still going to need your program and you're going to need your content. You're also going to need to train these general consultants as well to perform those specific duties or tasks for you. So just the hourly rate for these reps in a blended manner is really just a fraction of what the actual cost is to go about it in this option from an outsourced perspective. And by the time you go through these levels of requirements that are needed to get this in production, it could take some time as well, up to a year. What we've seen with organizations, what they're really looking for and what the board is looking for, they need to know hands down what it's going to cost. They need a static cost that they can put their hands around and they can actually put on a balance sheet. And that's exactly what we do with our data protection managed service. We're providing a fixed cost for our services that includes people, process, and technology to bring all of this to you and provide data protection and data security. And we're able to bring this to you in a production setting in 4 weeks or less from signing of contract. So at the end of the day, what are we actually doing here? We're allowing you to be the user of this program and this service, as opposed to being the owner of the tool and the service. And that's very compelling because it allows you to conduct your business as you do and let us worry about the security and the protection that's needed. So I want to go through some of the features of our data protection managed service. So it starts with the onboarding, and this is where we begin, where we're going to come in and we're going to gather all the objectives. We're going to understand what's, from an architecture perspective, what's going to be required so that we can deploy this data protection engine in your organization and support it for you. And also comes with this is building policy as well. But policy is more going to come after we've done the discovery level, where we work with you to help understand and identify where all this data is and what types of data we've identified and uncovered that we deem sensitive, and build the policies that are going to be required in order to protect that data in a process workflow that doesn't inhibit the operations of your businesses. That's where the classification piece and remediation is going to come in. So we're going to be able to build those policies, set those access controls, set those specific policies around that specific sensitive data that we've classified, and make sure, is it going to be redaction that needs to be done on some of that data, like you saw Blair show in the example? Could it be data masking? Is it going to be just out and out access policy? And we work with you and your teams and your organizations, both on the business and the technical side, to really understand what's going to be the most appropriate way to protect the data for your organization that makes sense. Then once we've done all this, there's the ongoing operations of what needs to be done. We've put this together, we've built the architecture, we've discovered the data, built the policy, and built this and architected it to run in your environment. But we did that for today. Your business, like any other business, is going to be different tomorrow. It's going to grow. It may grow organically. It may grow through acquisition. Things are going to change. Technology is going to evolve. And so is data transfer. So ongoing operations are very, very important. How many times have we seen when we own a tool and we install a tool and configure a tool, it works for today? But then there's a drift that happens over time where it's not as appropriate in meeting the expectations as it did day one down the road. And then those are always challenges that are always hard to keep up with. This is what's going to come with the managed service from working with Cadence Security and PKWARE. We'll be able to handle the ongoing operations and ensure success and efficiency and scale of this full service and deployment in your environment to make sure that it keeps up with your business as your business changes. And the last piece is going to be training. We're going to ensure that the people that need to be trained on the process in your organization are going to have the level of training that's required so that you can use this effectively and appropriately for your environments. So let's go in a little bit more about the managed services itself. So there's really 3 areas of our managed service. I kind of covered a lot of them on the recurring part on the last slide, but this is just to give you another example of those areas that we're going to work on for you. So from a recurring perspective, there's the service management, there's the updates and upgrades to the platform itself. There's also that policy management and maintenance to make sure that not only it works today, but those policies are managed and effective tomorrow as well. And then there's also that break fix, that end user support, that you have business people in your organization that may run into a bottleneck or a limitation or something that we need to step in and help. We're going to be there to be able to reach out to us and provide that, in an immediate fashion to you and your teams to make sure that we can handle anything that happens from that perspective from a support area. There's also going to be reporting that's going to be delivered in a consistent fashion as well. There'll be the monthly report analysis, and we'll also do this in a quarterly and annual basis as well. So you'll have an idea and a way to see exactly how the governance of the data protection is actually working. Where is the access? Who's accessing these files? And is everything being done according to plan? And is the data protected? You'll have the ability to see that in a consistent fashion. And also what we'll do in addition to those quarterly report deliverables, we're going to sit down with your organization quarterly and annually to ensure success of the platform for your environment, to make sure that it's meeting all the levels of criteria that were set in the beginning as our objective to build this program. So at this time, I want to turn it back over to Bridget and see if anyone has any questions.
Hi, yeah, we got 2 questions. The first one was for Blair. It is, you described some use cases, deleting files, marking out 6 digits on credit cards, etc. Are those the only use cases supported?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. That's a great question. Thanks to whoever asked it. It's sometimes hard in an environment like this, so I tried to give you a couple simple examples. I think the best way I can answer that question is to tell you what a policy actually looks like within Data Protection Managed Service. Basically, what a policy says is to what user should the policy apply. In other words, a policy could be universal and apply to everyone. It could only apply to a certain division of the company, a certain functional role, all the way down to a certain individual. Maybe we don't trust Blair very much, so we're only going to make this policy apply to Blair. So the first part of a policy is to who does it apply. The second part of the policy says what type of data should we look for. And it comes preloaded with things like credit card numbers and social security numbers and healthcare diagnostic codes. But you can also build, or the service can build with you, a very specific set of things that you wanted to search for if there were things unique to your organization. Then it says, where should we look for them? So you could say, only look for them in the documents folder, only look for them in their Microsoft OneDrive folder. So you can specify where to look. So we've said, to who does it apply? What should we look for? Where should we look for it? And then the final thing is, and what should we do if we find it? So that could be, in the examples I gave, it could be reporting, it could be deletion, it could be encrypting a file, it could be classifying, it could be opening it up and redacting. Basically, anything can be done as an action. It just needs to be specified as part of the policy. So I guess the short answer to the question, Bridget, is no, that's not all you're able to do in terms of use cases. And the longer answer is you basically define the who, what, where, and what you should do based on what you find.
Okay, thank you. And the last question we got was, what is the pricing structure for the service? How would you charge us? John, you want to take that one?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So let me go into that for you. So it's an operational expense, and it comes into It's an annual or multi-year contract vehicle. It's all inclusive of the managed service that includes the platform and everything rolled into one specific contract, and it's done by the user. We break it down into a scalable model of users from as small as about 500 user organizations to the large global organizations. So it's very flexible and it's very scalable, and it's all inclusive. So there's no breakout of platform purchase and then services or anything. It's not a distributed model. It's a full all-inclusive model from a contract perspective.
Great. Well, those were all the questions we got. So thank you, John, and thank you, Blair, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Overcoming the Complexities of Data Protection. We will be following up independently to hear your feedback and gauge your interest. So thank you guys again for joining, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep, thank you.